My name is Rachel Whitmore. I'm 33 years old. And for over a decade, I bled for my family's company. Not figuratively, I mean actual. Soul-eroding sacrifice. While my friends were exploring Europe or starting families, I was trapped inside glass conference rooms and freezing server rooms, troubleshooting back-end failures at 2 a.m., chugging cold coffee like Lifeline serum. I joined Evergrowth Digital when I was 22, straight out of college. Eager, naive, and stupidly loyal. My parents, Helen and Richard, had built the company from a converted garage in the outskirts of Seattle. It was their pride, their legacy, and they called me their future. Those words meant something to me back then. I wore them like armor. I was the kid who stayed late, who studied Google Ads, algorithms like gospel, who brought in big clients like Global Sync and kept them loyal with 80-hour weeks and perfectly polished decks. When they needed someone to fix the CRM in the middle of Christmas dinner, I answered. When our budget collapsed during Q2 of 2018, I deferred my own paycheck to keep operations running. That's how deep I was in. And not because I was told to, I wanted to prove myself worthy of inheriting the dream. My sister Vanessa Vanessa was a different story. 2 years younger. Magazine pretty. Charming in a TikTok influencer sort of way. She floated in and out of the business like a butterfly that only lands when there's champagne. She held the title of creative director. But in practice, that meant she curated the company's Instagram feed, oversaw mood boards she never completed, and took creative retreats every time there was real work to do. One week she'd be in Tulum, the next in Santorini. All while her expenses got mysteriously filed under client entertainment. I saw the receipts: $900 dinners, luxury handbags, spa treatments. I raised concerns. I flagged anomalies. I even spoke privately with our accountant. But every time I brought it up, the response was the same: Vanessa just thinks differently. She brings the brand soul. Rachel, don't be so rigid. That's why you're so good at operations, you're solid. At first, I let it go. I chalked it up to favoritism. Families are messy. Right. You pick your battles. But as the years dragged on, that favoritism became a dagger. I was invisible unless something broke. I was dependable. Dependable enough to ignore. That's when the ache started, a slow-burning sense that I was building someone else's kingdom. Still, I kept pushing. I kept thinking, maybe this is the price of legacy. Maybe one day they'll surprise me with a partnership letter. I started planning for it mentally, saving my ideas, creating strategies I hoped I'd one day present as co-CEO. But the thing about slow betrayal is, it doesn't hit you all at once. It creeps in quietly, like water through cracks in a dam. And then one day, the whole structure collapses. For me, that collapse came on a Thursday afternoon in late April. I was combing through archived client files, prepping for a pitch that Vanessa had, once again, bailed on last minute. I clicked into a restricted company drive one only executives had access to. Normally, I wouldn't dig there. But a file name caught my eye. Succession. 2024. Docs. I froze. Succession. I hadn't heard a word about succession. My stomach turned cold. Hands trembling. I opened the file. 2 paragraphs. That's all it took to rip my world apart. Full ownership of Evergrowth Digital to be transferred to Vanessa Whitmore upon retirement. A clean clause. No mention of me. No shared control. No equity. Just like that. I was erased. I stared at the screen for what felt like a full minute before I remembered how to breathe. I double-checked. Searched for another file. A side clause. Anything. Nothing. My name didn't appear on se. I printed it out anyway. Just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Watching the printer spit out page after page felt like torture. Each page was another shovel of dirt on a coffin I hadn't realized I was inside. I took those papers, walked into the break room, and sat under the fluorescent lights, listening to the quiet hum of the vending machine. Feeling like a ghost. I should have been furious. I should have cried. Screamed. Done something. But instead, I felt numb. There was a hollowness in my chest I couldn't explain. Like someone had scooped me out from the inside and left the shell standing. I didn't confront them right away. For 2 days, I pretended everything was normal. I attended meetings. I coached the junior marketing team. I even stayed late to clean up a system outage no one else noticed. But at night, I couldn't sleep. The betrayal looped in my head like static. I remembered every missed weekend. Every emergency call. Every time I bit my tongue while Vanessa rolled in with her designer shoes and fake deadlines. I had given them my 20s. And they gave my legacy to someone who couldn't even hold a calendar. On the 3rd day, I confronted them. It was Sunday dinner, Mom's famous roast beef. The kind she makes when she wants to feel like everything's fine. I waited until the plates were cleared. Then calmly pulled the documents from my bag and laid them on the table. Want to explain this? I asked. Their expressions didn't even flicker with guilt, just annoyance. Richard leaned back and said, "Don't be dramatic. Rachel, Vanessa needs stability. You'll be fine. You've always been the independent one." I remember the room tilting slightly. Like I was on a boat in rough water. "You're saying she needs it more than me. After everything I've done, you're smart. You'll land on your feet," Mom added, sipping her wine like we were talking about weekend plans. Vanessa didn't even flinch. She just shrugged and said, "Rachel, you always knew I was going to be the face of the brand. This just makes it official." Her smile was casual. Victorious. I don't remember walking out. I just remember the cold night air hitting my face like a slap and the sound of my heels on the sidewalk. Sharp and final. That was the moment the numbness cracked. The pain bled through. And something else began to rise in its place, something colder. Clearer. A resolve I hadn't known I was capable of. I went home that night and started a folder called Reclamation. Inside it, I began collecting everything I'd ever built. Every pitch. Every proposal. Every innovation that bore my fingerprints. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to take back what was mine. Because if they thought I'd roll over, they clearly hadn't been paying attention all these years. They forgot one thing. I wasn't just the workhorse. I was the architect. And I was about to tear the structure down from within. I didn't take a single sick day after that dinner. Not because I didn't need space, but because I couldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me retreat. I showed up every morning. Ran every meeting. Delivered every deadline. On the surface, I was the same Rachel, reliable, tireless, efficient. But underneath, something had changed. I had stopped building their company. From that point on, every move I made was about building my exit and making sure I didn't leave empty-handed. I started quietly gathering leverage. I downloaded backups of every client account I had managed. Saved full archives of performance reports and product documentation I had authored. If my name was on it, it went into my folder. Every time Vanessa took credit for a campaign she barely understood, I made a note. Every time my parents overlooked my input in favor of one of her branding intuitions, I saved the receipts. My silence became strategy. But information alone wouldn't be enough. I needed allies, people who had seen the work I'd done, who had witnessed the imbalance and could vouch for it. That's when I reached out to Robert Hayes, my old mentor. He'd retired 2 years prior, but we stayed in touch. Robert was the first person who had ever told me I had CEO instincts. He'd coached me through my first leadership crisis and quietly warned me, years ago, that favoritism would rot a company from the inside out. I called him from my car late one evening and asked if he could meet. He said yes, without hesitation. We met at a quiet wine bar downtown, one we used to visit after board meetings. I slid the documents across the table, the succession plan, the redacted ownership logs, and a photo of the whiteboard from 3 years ago with my name circled under future leadership. He read in silence, his brow tightening. Then he looked up and said, "They built this company with your labor, and then erased your name from the foundation. This isn't just betrayal, Rachel. It's exploitation." I nodded. I don't want revenge for the sake of ego, but I won't let them rewrite the story with me edited out. Robert leaned forward. Then you need to get ahead of it legally. And fast. I know someone. She specializes in family business disputes. Discreet, ruthless when needed. That's how I met Emily Tran, corporate attorney, Harvard Law. Ice-cold logic wrapped in warmth. Within 10 minutes of reviewing the files, she asked one question. "Are you ready to go all the way?" I didn't blink. "I am." She smiled. "Good. Then let's start by taking back the narrative." Over the next few weeks, we began building the case. I filed for a full audit of my employment history. We compiled years of emails, timestamped Slack conversations, and client testimonies. Emily was methodical, surgical. She found details I had forgotten, like the time I had manually rebuilt our billing infrastructure over Christmas break, or how I'd been listed as acting operations lead in a compliance filing during Vanessa's absence. Each thread Emily pulled unraveled more of the carefully curated myth my parents had built around Vanessa. But then, something happened I hadn't planned for. While cleaning out a storage unit my parents had stopped paying for, ironically under my name, I came across an old ledger that belonged to my grandfather, the company's original silent investor. Inside, folded between faded receipts and handwritten notes, was a clause, a legacy clause. It was notarized and signed, dated years before my parents incorporated Evergrowth formally. The clause explicitly stated that any transfer of ownership must include equitable recognition of contribution by active founding members. My name, Rachel M. Whitmore, was listed directly beneath in ink. I stared at the words, my heart racing. I had legal standing. My claim wasn't just emotional. It was embedded in the company's DNA from the beginning. I took a photo and sent it to Emily immediately. Her reply came in under a minute. "This changes everything." We filed to have the clause registered into the corporate structure and requested a temporary hold on any share transfers. Legally, we had entered the battlefield. But emotionally, I wasn't prepared for what came next. Word started to spread inside the company. Whispers in break rooms, side eyes in strategy meetings. Vanessa, of course, caught wind within a day. She confronted me in the hallway, heels clicking like gunshots against the marble floor. "You're suing the family, really?" Her voice was dripping with disbelief and venom. I didn't flinch. "I'm enforcing what's mine." You wouldn't understand that you've never built anything that lasted longer than your influencer phases. Her expression twisted. You've always been jealous. I tilted my heel. Of what, the designer debt or the empty title? She opened her mouth but said nothing. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. She didn't actually want the company. She just wanted the crown, the attention, the power of being chosen. But running the business, that had always been my role, and deep down, she knew it. I started to see it everywhere. In her panicked rescheduling of meetings, her sudden attempts to shadow me in key client calls, the forced way she clung to the image of being in control. She was unraveling. And it wasn't even public yet. Then came the first warning shot from my parents. I received an email marked urgent, private. It was from my father. It read, "You're hurting the family. Rachel, this isn't how we handle things. Please come to the house. We can discuss this like adults." I didn't reply. Because what he meant wasn't discuss. He meant persuade. He meant guilt. I forwarded it to Emily. She said, "They're bluffing. But expect a smear attempt. Be ready." 2 days later, it happened. Vanessa posted a photo carousel on Instagram. All sunshine and false nostalgia. Captioned, "Some people tear things down because they're too bitter to build their own." It didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew. But this time, I didn't feel small. I felt sharpened. Because while she was playing social optics, I was preparing for war. I reached out to our top client, Mr. Carter from Global Sync. I had worked with him for 6 years. I told him the truth, that I might be stepping away from Evergrowth soon, and I'd understand if they reevaluated their partnership. He replied instantly, "Rachel, we work with you. Not the logo. Wherever you go, we follow." I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that. For so long, I'd measured my worth through their approval. Now, someone on the outside was validating what they never could. And with every passing day, my confidence grew. I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was taking back authorship. I started laying the groundwork for my own venture. A consultancy lean. Values first. Built on transparency and execution. I called it Anchor Point Strategies. Robert agreed to serve as advisor. Emily would co-found. I lined up my first 3 clients before the paperwork even cleared. And in the final days before our legal hearing, I began to breathe again. Not fully. Not freely. But the fog of betrayal had begun to lift. Because for the first time in a decade, I was choosing myself. Still, I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The hearing. The confrontation. The collapse. But I wasn't afraid. Because I wasn't walking into battle as the discarded daughter anymore. I was walking in as the woman who built their empire and the one who would burn it down if she had to. The morning of the hearing felt like the air itself was holding its breath. I arrived early, intentionally dressed in a steel gray suit that made me look like someone you didn't want to underestimate. Emily stood beside me. Calm. Clipboard in hand. While Robert nodded silently from the back row. The courtroom wasn't large, but its silence carried weight. And when the doors opened and my parents stepped inside, flanked by their attorney and trailing behind them like an afterthought, Vanessa. All eyes turned. She wore an ivory blazer too pristine for reality. Her face painted in practiced serenity. But I could see it in her posture, the tight jaw, the slight tremble in her wrist as she adjusted her gold cuff. This wasn't Instagram. This wasn't curated. This was real. And she was terrified of exposure. The judge. A sharp-eyed woman in her 60s. Wasted no time. This case concerns the contested ownership transition of Evergrowth Digital LLC, she said. Voice clipped but steady. We will hear from both parties. Documentation has been pre-submitted. Let's begin. Emily rose first. No drama. No flair. Just facts layered with precision. She laid out my decade-long contributions. The original succession discussions. Emails where I had been labeled unofficial COO. Memos I'd authored that were passed off by Vanessa. The timing of the ownership transfer. And most importantly, the legacy clause. When she submitted the clause as Exhibit A, there was an audible murmur in the room. This document, handwritten and notarized by the founding silent investor, Rachel's grandfather, clearly states that any future ownership must equitably compensate contributing founders, of which only one name appears: Rachel M. Whitmore. The judge lifted the yellowed page, adjusted hair glasses, and read silently. Then she nodded once. A barely perceptible shift, but one that felt seismic. When their attorney responded, AD8, he leaned heavily on the idea that family agreements evolve, that Rachel was always compensated, and that Vanessa's branding contributions were crucial to Evergrowth's image. It was weak, vague. Even the judge seemed unimpressed. But then, Vanessa asked to speak. Against her lawyer's advice. She stood up, cleared her throat, and launched into a monologue that sounded almost sincere if you didn't know her like I did. Rachel is brilliant, she said, voice wavering just enough to seem vulnerable. She's always been the workhorse, the engine. But some of us are born to lead from the front, to represent. I've built our social identity, shaped the brand voice, grown the community. If you take this away from me, you erase what I've created. It was the performance of a lifetime. Even I had to give her credit. She knew how to play the room. For a moment, the courtroom was quiet. And then Emily smiled. Your Honor, may we now submit Exhibit B? She asked. With a nod, she pressed play on a screen that faced the courtroom. A recorded Zoom call, dated 2 months prior, between Vanessa and a junior graphic designer. Vanessa's voice echoed, ugh. Just slap a gradient on it. No one reads the captions anyway. I don't care if the numbers are off. Rachel will fix it. The designer, clearly confused, asked. But the client, Vanessa interrupted, we don't get paid to be accurate. We get paid to be visible. A gasp broke the courtroom stillness. Vanessa turned pale. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. And that's when Mr. Carter stood up from the public seating. Your Honor, he said, I'm not a legal party to this case. But I'd like to make a statement as Evergrowth's largest client. The judge allowed it. He stepped forward. We have stayed with Evergrowth for 6 years because of one person, Rachel. Her strategy. Her execution. Her leadership. If she leaves, so do we. If she's not the owner, we walk. And trust me, we're not the only ones. His words hit like thunder. No lawyer could counter that. No curated image could survive it. Vanessa blinked rapidly, her mouth twitching as if looking for a response that didn't exist. My parents avoided eye contact, their silence louder than any apology. After a brief recess, the ruling was read aloud. The ownership transfer was declared invalid. Vanessa's claims to the company were suspended pending full internal audit. My employment history and the legacy clause were upheld as grounds for breach. The company was placed under court-mandated transition management. I walked out of that courtroom with more than just a victory. I walked out with proof that I wasn't crazy. That I wasn't dramatic. That everything I gave wasn't just invisible labor. But something real. Something valuable. And, for once, everyone saw it. But I wasn't done. With Evergrowth in limbo and my legal footing secure, I activated the next phase. I officially launched Anchorpoint Strategies. We held our first advisory roundtable that weekend. Our client roster tripled by Wednesday. I offered severance to 3 undervalued employees at Evergrowth and invited them to join me. Every single one said yes. Vanessa tried to post a vague message about resilience through loss, but comments tore it apart. Former colleagues began speaking out, sharing stories of how she'd mocked junior staff, how she skimmed budget approvals, how she once forwarded an entire campaign draft to a competitor because their aesthetic is better. It wasn't revenge. I was watching, it was unraveling. And I didn't even have to touch it. Then came the family fallout. I received a letter handwritten, oddly, from my mother. It was 5 pages of emotional guilt. This isn't what your grandfather would have wanted. You're tearing us apart. Vanessa needs your support now more than ever. I read it once, folded it neatly, and threw it in the fireplace. Because what they wanted was for me to be the silence that made their comfort possible. But I had become the voice that made their comfort unsustainable. I wasn't fueled by anger anymore. I was anchored in clarity. My life was no longer built on unspoken sacrifices and invisible labor. It was mine, my name, my clients, my team. I'd always thought revenge would feel like fire. But it didn't. It felt like release. It felt like finally breathing in a room with windows wide open. Still, one moment lingered in my mind, the look on my father's face as the ruling was read. Not anger. Not shame. Just confusion. Like he truly couldn't comprehend why I didn't just accept what they gave me. Like his entire worldview fractured at the thought that the daughter who never caused trouble had grown teeth. That was the moment I knew they would never understand. And that was the moment I stopped needing them to. The days after the hearing moved slowly. Like time had thickened. There were no more court filings. No dramatic confrontations. No public fallouts, just an eerie quiet that settled over my life. Like the moment after a storm, when the wind stops howling and the wreckage begins to settle. I thought I would feel triumphant. Like a warrior returning home from battle. Instead, what I felt was something more complicated. There was satisfaction. Yes, but also grief. Not for the company. Not even for my parents. But for the version of myself that had held onto the illusion for so long. The girl who had believed that loyalty was currency. That if you worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, earned enough, one day you would be seen. That version of me had died quietly somewhere in that courtroom. And in her place stood someone stronger but harder. Someone who no longer needed to be chosen, but who had chosen herself. Anchorpoint was growing fast. The kind of momentum that felt inevitable. Like the market had just been waiting for someone to break free from old models and offer clarity. We built fast. Hired smart. And didn't waste time with performative culture. We didn't circle back. We decided. We didn't call ourselves a family, we were a team. And that clarity was magnetic. Clients respected it. My team thrived in it. Even I was adjusting to the idea that I didn't have to beg to be heard. And yet, beneath the pride and progress, there were still sharp edges. Little echoes of bitterness that appeared at unexpected moments. Like when I passed the Evergrowth building on my way to a new client pitch and felt that twist in my stomach, not of regret, but of recognition. That used to be mine. Not the name. Not the sign. But the structure. The systems. The soul. It had been mine. And they'd given it away like an afterthought. I hadn't spoken to my parents since the hearing. They hadn't reached out again. And I hadn't offered an olive branch. At first, it felt like relief. Then it felt like something closer to exile. The holidays were approaching. And for the first time in my adult life, I didn't receive an invitation. No, we'd love to see you. No passive-aggressive voicemail from my mother asking if I was still upset. Just silence. I should have felt liberated. I should have celebrated. But there was a hollow space where expectation used to live. I realized then that revenge might deliver justice. But it doesn't deliver healing. Healing is something you have to choose afterward. And I wasn't sure yet if I was ready. The real shift came unexpectedly. I was at a networking event. One I almost skipped. When I ran into Lisa Whitmore, my father's sister. My aunt. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years. She had been exiled from the family after some vague financial disagreement that no one ever explained to me when I was younger. But there she was. Sipping a gin and tonic. Dressed in tailored black. A woman who had long stopped caring what her brother thought. When she saw me, her face softened. "Rachel," she said. "You finally got out." He blinked. "Out." She laughed gently. "Out from under Richard and Helen's delusions. I watched you for years. They always used you as ballast, solid. Heavy. Never drifting too far. Vanessa was the sail. But you were the weight that kept the ship steady." She paused. They never respected the ballast. But they couldn't stay afloat without it. I stood there. Stunned. "Why are you telling me this now?" she shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to be cast aside. And because I still have something that might belong to you." She handed me a flash drive. Old emails. "Your grandfather copied me on a lot of early conversations. You should read them." That night, I plugged the drive into my laptop with no expectations. What I found inside was staggering. Conversations between my grandfather and my parents in the early days of Evergrowth. He warned them repeatedly not to let ego override merit. He had insisted Rachel be groomed for leadership. Cited her intellect. Her work ethic. Her instincts. If she is the future. One email read. Then treat her like the future, not just the insurance plan. Another line. Seared into my mind forever. If you fail to recognize her value, she will find her own way, and when she does, she won't come back. I sat staring at the screen. Heart pounding. It was validation. Yes, but also prophecy. My grandfather had seen all of this coming. He had tried to stop it. And they had ignored him. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't care. That night, I wrote him a letter. He was long gone. But I needed to say it. You were right. I found my own way. And I'm not coming back. I didn't send it. Obviously. But I printed it. Folded it. And placed it in the back of my grandfather's old ledger, the one with the legacy clause. It felt like closure. Even if no one else saw it. The next week, I received a message from Vanessa. Just one line. "Are you happy now?" I stared at it for a long time. I thought about all the ways I could respond. The monologue I could unleash. The facts I could throw in her face. But in the end, I just deleted it. Because the answer was complicated. I wasn't happy because she'd lost. I wasn't happy because I'd won. I was at peace because I had chosen myself. Finally. And built something no one could take from me. Happiness wasn't the goal. Wholeness was. Still. One thing remained. I knew there would be whispers. Stories told in half-truths at holiday tables I no longer sat at. I would be cast as the cold one. The bitter one. The traitor. But I could live with that. Because the truth was that I wasn't the villain of this story. I was simply the one who refused to be erased. I didn't burn bridges. I revealed which ones were already hollow and watched them collapse under their own weight. And yet, a part of me still wonders if they had just said one thing. One honest word, would I have stayed? Would any of this have happened if they had simply said, "We were wrong. We see you." But they didn't. And now it's too late. Months passed. The kind that move both quickly and slowly, where everything changes. But the memory of what came before still clings like fog to glass. Anchor Point continued to grow. But I stopped checking our metrics every morning. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer needed numbers to prove I existed. Clients came. Referrals multiplied. And the team I built began to take shape in ways Evergrowth never allowed open. Collaborative. New politics masquerading as professionalism. I watched junior strategists pitch billion-dollar campaigns without fear. I saw designers challenge ideas. Engineers propose structural rewrites. And every time they did, I smiled. Because that culture, that trust, it had roots in what I had once tried to plant at Evergrowth. Only now, it was finally blooming. One evening, I found myself walking alone through Pioneer Square. The streets were lit in soft amber from the old lamps, and rain glossed the pavement like varnish. I stopped at a bench across from what used to be our first office. It was a yoga studio now. No trace of Evergrowth left. I thought about the nights I'd worked there with just vending machine snacks and fluorescent lights. I thought about the version of me that sat cross-legged on the floor, high on ambition and caffeine, thinking one day I'd make partner, not knowing the door had already been locked from the inside. And I thought about all the versions of me that had been required to break, just so I could finally see who I actually was. I wasn't Rachel the assistant, or the fixer, or the dependable one. I was Rachel Whitmore. Founder. Strategist. Leader. Not because anyone gave me permission, but because I'd taken it. There's something no one tells you about winning a revenge story. It doesn't feel like a high. It feels like clarity. It feels like silence. But not the bad kind, the kind that comes after you close a chapter so fully. There's no echo left behind. People assume revenge is about retribution. But for me, it was always about reclamation. Not of a company. Not even of a name. But of worth. Of narrative. Of identity. There is a special kind of violence in being made invisible. In being useful but not seen. Loyal but not loved. And for years, I had told myself that I was okay with that. That being essential behind the scenes was enough. But it wasn't. Not really. Because when you are constantly made to feel like a tool, eventually, you begin to ask, what happens when I stop being useful? Who am I without my labor? The answer, it turns out, is I am still enough. A few weeks later, I got a call from Mr. Carter. We'd kept in touch regularly. But this call was different. Rachel, he said, there's a tech summit next month. They're doing a panel on post-founder success stories. I told them about you. They want you as the keynote. My first instinct was to decline. I didn't want the spotlight. But then I thought, what would the old Rachel have done? Declined out of politeness. Out of fear of seeming arrogant. So I said yes. And 3 weeks later, I stood on a stage under warm lights. A full room waiting. I told the story not with venom, not with bitterness, but with truth. I spoke about invisibility, about loyalty without recognition, about waking up and realizing you've spent 10 years building someone else's dream at the expense of your own. The room was silent when I finished. Then someone clapped. Then the whole room. And afterward, the line to speak to me wrapped around the auditorium. People weren't drawn to my success. They were drawn to the fact that I had been broken and rebuilt publicly, painfully, and had come out the other side not just intact, but sharper. Women thanked me. Young founders asked for advice. A man in his 50s told me he walked away from a toxic job because of my article in Forbes. I realized then that the most powerful revenge isn't burning bridges, it's building new ones where others can walk after you. That's when it hit me, the story I'd spent years trying to write wasn't really about them. It was about me. It was always about me. My parents never reached out again. Vanessa tried. Once. Tagging me in a performative growth and forgiveness post on LinkedIn. But I ignored it. There are some relationships that don't need closure. Some chapters end without an epilogue. And sometimes the cleanest forgiveness is distance. I no longer needed their validation. I didn't even need their apology. What they'd done was irreversible, but what I'd done with it was undeniable. I had turned betrayal into blueprint, erasure into enterprise, grief into granite. My worth no longer lived in their gaze, it lived in mine. One afternoon, while going through an old desk drawer in my new office, I found a notebook. It was from 5 years ago, filled with ideas I'd once pitched, ideas that had been ignored, minimized, or stolen. I flipped through the pages slowly. My handwriting was different back then, tighter, more hesitant, as if even my pen didn't believe I deserved the space I was taking up. I smiled. I didn't feel sad. I felt grateful. Because she past me had survived. And not only that, she had built the path I now walked. There's a line I go back to often, scribbled in that same notebook. A quote I don't remember writing, but now feel in my bones. If they cannot see your light, let it blind them. So that's what I did. I stopped dimming myself. I stopped apologizing for being powerful. Precise. Prepared. I stopped shrinking. And the world, surprisingly, made room. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being angry. Not because they didn't deserve my rage, but because I finally understood the value of my peace. The truest form of power isn't vengeance. It's detachment. It's waking up one morning, drinking your coffee, and realizing you're not thinking about them at all. They gave away the company. I built an empire. And I didn't just win, I freed myself. Story 2. My name is Lauren Miller. I'm 62 years old. And after nearly 4 decades working in public infrastructure in Seattle, I retired 2 weeks ago. It wasn't a glamorous job, no fancy titles, no applause, but steady, reliable work that kept things running. I never craved a spotlight. I just wanted to do my part. Quietly. Without fuss. For years, I carried the weight of my family's stability on my shoulders. Often invisible but always present. So naturally, I expected anything from them on my retirement day. Maybe a dinner. A card. A simple acknowledgement that I mattered. But when I walked through the front door that evening, the silence hit me harder than any words could. The house was empty. No cars in the driveway. No messages. No calls. Diane, my wife, had told me, "You'll get the celebration you deserve." But the hours slipped by with nothing but silence. I checked the shared family calendar completely blank. I called Diane, straight to voicemail. Emily. My daughter. The same. David. My son texts unanswered. I sat alone in the living room. The quiet pressing down like a weight. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Then I opened Instagram. My heart stopped. There. In vivid color. I was a photo of my entire family on a yacht. Dressed up. Glasses raised high in laughter and cheers. The caption read, "Finally, a trip without the boring old lady." My breath caught. I saw Diane dancing on the deck. Smiling like she belonged there. Like I wasn't part of this moment at all. The comments flooded in jokes. Laughing emojis. Teasing remarks. Not one mention of me. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there. Stunned. Swallowed by a silence louder than any confrontation. I realized something I had tried to ignore for years. I wasn't truly part of this family anymore. What had I become to them? Invisible. Unnecessary. Just a name on bank statements and bills they never bothered to mention. The woman who kept everything running behind the scenes, the family's quiet backbone, had been replaced by a version of myself that no longer existed. And now, that version was gone for good. The next day, my phone blew up with missed calls and frantic texts. Diane. Emily. David. Even my brother-in-law calling. Pleading. Demanding I answer. But I didn't. The truth was already clear. And I couldn't pretend anymore. That Instagram post wasn't a careless mistake, it was a cruel unveiling. A moment where the mask slipped, revealing what they really thought about me. Years ago, I worked overtime during storms so my kids wouldn't worry. I cashed out part of my pension to help David and his wife buy their first home. I co-signed Emily's salon lease when Diane's business was struggling. I quietly paid bills, covered repairs, and supported the family vacation home, my name alone on the deed. The SUV Diane drove, leased under my name, fully paid for. The boat David borrowed every summer, also mine, docked under my name, insured and registered. The private school tuition for my granddaughter funded from my pension withdrawals. He had given so much, and all along, they only saw what I could provide. They needed the money, the favors, the stability, but never me. They laughed without me, celebrated without me, erased me. That wasn't anger, I felt it was something colder. A deep, quiet, calm settling into every part of me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. 2 days after that yacht post, the family returned home. I stayed in my office, listening as their whispers filled the kitchen. Diane knocked softly, voice gentle, pretending all was normal. "Lauren, can we talk?" she asked. I didn't answer. I wasn't ready. That morning, I printed 5 letters, simple, unsigned, but final, and left them on the kitchen table. Diane's letter said she had 30 days to refinance or return the SUV lease. David's told him to return the boat keys and surrender marina access. Emily's gave her 60 days to refinance or close her salon lease. David's wife's letter revoked any permission to use my tax credentials. The final letter announced the family vacation home was being listed for sale, giving them 2 weeks to make an offer. No yelling, no tears, just clear boundaries drawn in ink. I watched Diane freeze when she saw the envelope. Emily cried quietly in the hallway. The silence in the house shifted. It was no longer awkward or apologetic. Just cautious. That night, Diane tried again to talk. I looked at her. Not with anger, but with something deeper, a finality she hadn't seen before. I wasn't the woman they had taken for granted anymore. I was someone who had finally remembered her own worth. Days passed. The silence lingered like a shadow. But it wasn't empty. Bank emails flagged Emily's salon loan. Diane's refinancing applications were rejected without my credit. David found his marina access blocked. Tuition payments bounced without warning. One evening, Diane confronted me. Calm but exhausted. "Lauren, let's just talk," she said. I looked at her not with rage or bitterness, but with an unshakable resolve, and simply walked away. That night, I heard her crying. Then the quick tap of messages sent to the kids. He's going through something. But I wasn't. I was finally free. I was watching everything I had built for them slowly crumble because I had stepped back. No apologies came. They wanted the old Lauren, the one who fixed everything silently and endlessly. But she was gone. The foundation had cracked. And now, they had to live with the consequences. This was the moment my life truly began to change. The moment I stopped being the invisible woman who paid for everything but got nothing in return. I wasn't angry anymore. I was done being invisible. Days stretched into a quiet battle. The house, once filled with chatter and life, now echoed with silence and a tension heavier than any words. My family was reeling, trying to understand the boundaries I'd drawn. But no one dared break the fragile calm I'd created. Every morning I woke early, brewed my coffee, and walked the dog through the quiet streets of our Seattle neighborhood. The same routine I'd held for decades. But now, the routine was mine alone, untouched by anyone else's needs or demands. The texts came sporadically at first, please masked as concern. Veiled attempts at reconnecting. Emily's messages were the most frequent. Her tone shifting from hurt to desperation. "Mom, please. Let's talk. We can fix this," she wrote. As if the problem was something small. A misunderstanding to be cleared up with a conversation. But this wasn't about fixing anything. It was about finally facing the truth no one else wanted to admit. David was quieter. When he called, his voice was strained, filled with the kind of guilt that only comes when you realize you've taken someone's love and loyalty for granted. "Lauren, I didn't mean for it to come to this," he said once. But I simply listened and said nothing. Words felt useless now. What mattered was what had already been done and what I was finally willing to accept. Behind the scenes, I began to take stock not just of my family, but of myself. For so long, I had defined my worth by how much I could give, how much I could support, how much I could sacrifice. But those roles, those expectations, they had drained me. I realized I had no idea who I was outside of the caretaker, the provider, the boring old lady they so openly mocked. So, I started small. I booked a weekend getaway to a small cottage on the coast. A place I'd quietly been renovating over the past year with leftover savings. No family. No obligations, just me and the sound of waves breaking against the shore. I needed to rediscover myself. To breathe in the freedom I'd never truly allowed. The first morning there, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. For the first time, I wasn't someone's mother, wife, or provider. I was just Lauren. And that was enough. Back at home, my family was unraveling in ways they didn't expect. Diane's calls slowed, replaced by awkward silences. Emily's salon faced an uncertain future, with landlords growing impatient and bills mounting without my guarantee. David's boat remained docked. Keys returned. Marina access revoked. Even the vacation home, once a symbol of family unity, was being listed for sale. I watched from a distance as their carefully constructed world began to crack under the weight of their own neglect. But the real surprise came when Diane tried to stage a family night at a local restaurant. A last-ditch effort to reset the narrative. I agreed to go not because I'd forgiven them, but because I wanted to see how they would face me now. I stripped of the safety net I'd provided for so long. The dinner was a study in forced smiles and careful words. A small happy retirement sign hung awkwardly on the wall. Diane raised a glass in a flat toast, calling me the foundation of this family. Words that tasted hollow. Emily gave a hug that felt rehearsed. David cracked a joke that fell flat. When the moment came for me to speak, I didn't raise my glass. Instead, I pulled out my phone and showed them the Instagram post yacht. Laughter. Their faces full of joy. But no room for me. No apologies. No regrets. Just the cold, hard truth, laid bare. I saw the color drain from David's face, heard Emily whisper, "My name," and watched Diane's confident mask crumble. Without a word, I stood, took my coat, and walked out. No need for a fight. No need for drama. Just the undeniable fact that the old Lauren was gone. That night, back at the cottage, I felt a strange mix of sadness and liberation. I was finally living life on my terms. The phone rang less. Messages slowed. And the family's attempts at contact became increasingly sporadic and desperate. But I was no longer their crutch. No longer their invisible safety net. For the first time, I started thinking about what I wanted. Simple things, quiet mornings, long walks on the beach, reading books I loved, making my own plans without guilt. The freedom was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. As the sun set over the water, I realized something profound: the love I had spent a lifetime giving, without conditions, wasn't reciprocated. And that truth was bitter, but it was also the key to my peace. Yet, even as I embraced this new chapter, shadows lingered. I knew this wasn't the end of our story. The wounds were still fresh. And beneath the surface, resentment and confusion simmered. Would they ever truly understand what I sacrificed? Would they ever face the consequences of their actions? And, more importantly, was I willing to forgive, or did I need something more from them? These questions haunted me as I stared at the waves, knowing that the path ahead was uncertain. But for the first time, it was my path, not theirs. As days turned into weeks, the silence from my family was deafening. Their sporadic messages had dried up, replaced by an uncomfortable void. The phone remained mostly silent, save for a few rare calls from my daughter Emily, who was perhaps the closest to breaking through the wall I had built. But even those calls were short, full of half-hearted apologies and vague promises to make things right someday. I knew those words were just echoes in the wind, empty phrases to soothe their own guilt. Not a true path toward reconciliation. The cottage by the coast became my sanctuary, a quiet refuge where I could peel back the layers of exhaustion, betrayal, and loss. Each morning, I watched the sunrise with a clarity I hadn't known for years. The ocean's vastness mirrored the emptiness I felt inside. But it also reminded me that life, like the tide, was always moving forward. I was no longer trapped in the currents of their expectations. But even as I embraced this new freedom, there was a shadow. I couldn't shake the weight of what I had left behind. The family I had nurtured, supported, and sacrificed for was now distant and fractured. Their lives went on without me. But I was no longer a part of the script they'd written. I was the forgotten author, cast aside when my role was no longer convenient. One afternoon, a letter arrived, a crisp envelope with unfamiliar handwriting. It was from my son-in-law, Mark. The contents were formal, businesslike, but with an undertone of something raw and unresolved. He was asking for a meeting, a chance to talk through the financial separations and perhaps, somewhere buried beneath the legalities, a hint of reconciliation. I sat with that letter for hours, torn between opening a door I wasn't sure I wanted to reopen and closing myself off completely. Part of me longed for connection, for the family I once had, while another part bristled at the idea of revisiting old wounds. Finally, I decided to meet him not because I trusted him or expected forgiveness, but because I owed it to myself to confront the past fully, without running. The meeting was tense from the start. Mark was guarded, his usual charm replaced by a sober acknowledgement of the damage done. He admitted mistakes, financial mismanagement, disrespect, taking my support for granted. But beneath the apologies, I sensed something else, a fear of losing control, of facing a reality where I was no longer their safety net. As we talked, I realized how deeply their reliance on me had shaped not just their lives but my own identity. For decades, I had been the family's backbone, the invisible thread holding everything together. Now, that thread was unraveling, and they were struggling to find balance without it. After the meeting, I walked along the beach, the cold wind biting at my face. The conversation had stirred a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, but also a fierce determination. I was done being invisible, done being the boring old lady whose presence was only valued when tied to money and favors. This was my moment. I would rebuild not for them, but for myself. No more sacrifices hidden behind smiles. No more giving until I was empty. It was time to reclaim my life on my own terms. To write a new story where I was the protagonist, not just a supporting character. Meanwhile, back home, the cracks in the family facade grew wider. Emily's salon struggled without the business loan guarantee, forcing her to confront harsh realities about independence and responsibility. David, stripped of marina access and financial support, faced mounting debts and a reckoning with his own pride. Diane, my wife, seemed caught between anger and regret. Her once confident demeanor replaced by quiet moments of reflection and loneliness. The dynamics shifted subtly but irrevocably, without my presence as a constant. The family had to face truths they had long avoided. But whether that would lead to growth or further fractures was still uncertain. One evening, a surprise visitor arrived at the cottage. Emily. She stood hesitantly at the door, a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. She didn't come with apologies or demands, just a desire to understand, to bridge the gap between us. We talked long into the night, peeling back years of pain and misunderstanding. For the first time, I saw her not just as my daughter, but as a person struggling with her own burdens. And she saw me not as an untouchable provider, but as a woman seeking respect and recognition. That night planted a seed not of instant healing, but of possibility. Perhaps this fractured family could find a way forward, but only if we all face the truth without illusions. As I closed the door behind Emily, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But it was tempered by caution. The journey ahead would be long and fraught, and I wasn't sure if we all had the strength to walk it together. For now, I returned to the quiet rhythm of the cottage, the waves crashing like a reminder that life moves on, with or without us, and I was finally ready to move on my own terms. The days that followed Emily's visit were quieter but charged with unspoken tension. The cottage felt less like a refuge and more like a crossroads. I found myself reflecting on everything: the years of giving, the silent sacrifices, the moments I ignored my own needs to hold a family together that never truly saw me. But now, standing at this precipice, I knew something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't just breaking away, I was beginning to rebuild, brick by brick, on my own terms. Emily's arrival wasn't just a visit, it was a signal that some connections, no matter how strained, were not entirely severed. But I could see in her eyes the pain of carrying a weight she wasn't ready to drop. And in her hesitation, the fear of losing the last fragment of what family once was. We shared stories late into the night, not about blame or resentment, but about dreams deferred and the quiet loneliness behind smiles worn for appearances. Meanwhile, back in the city, the fallout was accelerating. Diane's once iron grip on the household was loosening. The SUV sat unused in the driveway, a stark reminder of the boundaries Lauren had drawn. The salon's temporarily closed sign hung crooked in the window, mirroring the unraveling of years of financial support and unquestioned reliance. David, stripped of marina privileges, had turned from defiant to desperate, making calls late into the night, searching for solutions that weren't there. At family gatherings, the air grew heavy with avoidance. Conversations circled around trivial topics, but beneath the surface lay a simmering mix of regret, guilt, and unspoken accusations. The absence of Lauren's steady presence was felt like a vacuum pulling at the edges of their fragile facade. One night, as I sat alone on the porch, watching the moonlight dance on the water, my phone buzzed unexpectedly. It was a message from Diane. No accusations, no demands, just a simple line. "Can we talk?" I stared at it longer than I cared to admit, heart pounding with a mix of anger, hope, and cautious curiosity. When we finally spoke, her voice was softer than I remembered. She admitted her own fears: the loss of control, the guilt masked as anger, the loneliness behind the dismissive jokes. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was a crack in the armor that had kept us both apart. We spoke not as enemies, but as two people who had shared decades of life, complicated by silence and unmet expectations. But the most unexpected moment came from David. After weeks of radio silence, he showed up at the cottage unannounced. His eyes were tired, shoulders hunched with the weight of his own failures. For the first time, and he looked at me not as the provider or the obstacle, but as his mother, flawed, strong, and human. He didn't come with excuses or demands. Instead, he brought a fragile olive branch, a request to understand what had changed and if there was a way back from the edge. Our conversation was awkward but honest, a tentative step toward healing, even if the road ahead remained uncertain. The tension within the family now felt like a living thing, pulsing with possibility and threat. Each interaction was a careful dance around fragile egos and old wounds. The letters I had sent, the boundaries I'd drawn, they were no longer just paperwork. They had become symbols of a new reality that none of us could ignore. And yet, Amid the shifting landscape, I found unexpected allies. My neighbor Clara, a widow with her own history of family estrangement, became a steady presence. Her wisdom and quiet empathy reminded me that healing was not a solitary path. And sometimes, support came from the most unlikely places. As weeks passed, the idea of revenge transformed. It was no longer about punishment or payback. Instead, it became a reclamation of power, the power to define my own worth. To live without the constant drain of unreciprocated sacrifice. The yacht parties, the ignored birthdays, the silent phone, all faded into a backdrop against which I built a new life. Still, the past was not easily laid to rest. Mark's sporadic messages hinted at unfinished business, while the legal processes of untangling shared assets dragged on. Each document a reminder of the fractures beneath the surface. One evening, at a community event in the nearby town, I found myself face to face with Diane and Emily. The air was thick with unspoken words. Diane's smile was tentative. Emily's eyes held a mix of apology and longing. For a moment, we stood suspended in time, the ghosts of the past whispering between us. Then, with a steady breath, I smiled back. Not a full reconciliation, but a truce. A recognition that while the wounds were fresh, the possibility of repair existed if we were willing to walk the difficult path. As I returned to the quiet of the cottage, I felt a sense of calm that had eluded me for years. The road ahead was uncertain, full of challenges I couldn't yet see. But I was no longer afraid. I was no longer the boring old lady on the sidelines. I was the author of my own story. And this chapter was just beginning. Months had passed since I retreated to my cottage. And in that time, a new rhythm emerged not just in my life, but in the tangled web of my family's existence. The house, once bustling with noise and obligation, now stood quiet, its walls holding memories, but no longer commanding my presence. I watched as the pieces of my past life settled into place, some drifting away, others settling into new forms I could no longer control. The day the vacation home sold was bittersweet. Watching the closing documents signaled an irrevocable shift. That home had been a symbol of our family legacy, a place where laughter and arguments mingled in equal measure. Yet, as the paperwork passed hands, I felt no sorrow, only a strange sense of relief. It was a chapter closing, a space cleared for what was next. The finality was both unsettling and strangely liberating. How many more endings would I face before I could truly say I was free? Calls and messages dwindled, replaced by silence that echoed louder than any confrontation. When words finally came, they were cautious and fragmented, apologies thinly veiled behind pride and confusion. I chose not to respond. The story had been told, not in accusations or tears, but through the quiet assertion of boundaries. That silence, that refusal to engage on their terms. I was the loudest message I could send. I wasn't the family's shadow anymore. I was a force rewriting the narrative. Yet, amidst this distance, unexpected connections grew. Clara, my neighbor, became a steadfast confidante, a sounding board for my fears and hopes. Her stories of loss and renewal mirrored my own. And through her, I glimpsed the possibility of rebuilding not just family ties, but a life rooted in authenticity and self-respect. The irony was not lost on me after decades of giving to others. I was finally receiving something priceless, unconditional support. But not all wounds heal evenly. David's presence remained unpredictable. His efforts to reconcile were sincere but faltered under the weight of unspoken resentments. Our conversations were a dance of hesitations and tentative steps, as if we were learning to speak a new language forged from shared pain and reluctant forgiveness. It was clear this path would be long and uneven. But for the first time, it felt like we were walking it together, rather than apart. As spring warmed the air, I found myself drawn back to the city for a family event, a reunion planned by Emily. A tentative olive branch extended in good faith. The evening was charged with cautious hope and unresolved tensions. Diane and David were there, their faces a mixture of apology and guarded optimism. My children hovered on the edges, unsure how to bridge the gaps that years of silence and disappointment had carved. The reunion was not a fairy tale, it was raw, imperfect, and deeply human. Old grievances surfaced alongside moments of laughter. Stories were told and retold, refracted through the lens of new understanding. I spoke less, listened more, letting the fragments of connection piece themselves together without forcing a resolution. It was enough to be present, to witness the fragile beauty of a family learning to heal not by erasing the past, but by acknowledging it. In the quiet moments after the event, I reflected on the journey from betrayal to forgiveness, from invisibility to self-worth. Revenge, once a burning fire, had cooled into a steady flame of self-empowerment. I realized the true victory was not in punishment, but in reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my voice. The family that had dismissed me was still there, but so was I. No longer invisible, no longer silenced. That night, as I sat on the porch, watching the stars blink awake, I understood that healing is not a destination, but a process. It requires patience, courage, and the willingness to let go of what no longer serves us. I was ready for whatever came next, not because I had forgotten the past, but because I had chosen to move beyond it, on my own terms. Story 3. My name is Emily. I'm 34 years old. And 6 days ago, I was lying in a hospital bed after emergency surgery, feeling every stitch in my body, every ache amplified by the cold sterility around me. No flowers, no calls, no visitors. Just the hum of machines and the soft footsteps of nurses passing by. But the thing that cut deepest wasn't the surgery itself, it was knowing that my family had chosen to go on vacation instead of being there for me. They posted pictures from Maui all over Instagram, smiling under the sun, sipping cocktails by waterfalls, calling it family time while I was left alone in that sterile room. I remember the moment I saw my phone light up. Not with messages asking if I was okay, but with their smiling vacation posts. My mom, my dad, my brother, his wife, even my younger cousins, all together. But none with a single thought for me. The captions stung. Family is everything. Making memories with loved ones. So blessed to be surrounded by those who matter most. Not one, get well soon. Not even a message saying they missed me. Later that day, I summoned the courage to text my mom. I asked simply, "Why hasn't anyone come to visit?" Her reply was colder than the hospital walls around me. "We're not wasting money on you. If you want us to visit, pay for our tickets." I stared at the screen in disbelief, the sting of her words sinking deep. 3 hours later, a message from my brother landed in my inbox. "Maybe some time alone will finally teach you not to be such an embarrassment." It wasn't just cruel. It was the final confirmation of a truth I'd long tried to ignore. In that moment, despite everything, I smiled. Because I realized something important. I had spent years bending over backwards for these people, covering their bills, supporting their dreams, staying silent through the hurt. And now, laid up and vulnerable, I was finally seeing the real story. I was the one they discarded when it was inconvenient. The one they treated like an afterthought, a backup plan, an embarrassment. But this time, things were going to be different. For years, quietly and without fanfare, I had built something they never saw coming. A startup I'd nurtured from nothing. I didn't flaunt it, I didn't have to. The payoff was enough to change a lot of lives, including theirs. I had set up a family trust that covered my parents' mortgage. I backed my brother's struggling business with loans through shell companies to protect his pride. I anonymously paid for my cousin's tuition, medical expenses, and rent, hoping someday they'd see me as more than just the awkward sibling. But the hospital bed gave me clarity, cold, unforgiving clarity. On day 6, after another sleepless night, I made a few quiet calls. The family trust was dissolved, effective immediately. The loan guarantee I had made for my brother was pulled. Emergency accounts set up for family needs were frozen pending a review. And then, I waited. They returned home sunburned and smiling, their phones full of memories and selfies oblivious to the storm about to hit. I sent each of them a simple package. No letters, no accusations. Just printed statements listing every payment I'd made over the last 3 years. Stamped boldly. Support terminated effective immediately. Some called. I didn't answer. Others sent angry texts or tried to guilt me with fabricated confusion. But I was done. I was just getting started. Being discharged from the hospital, I didn't even expect anyone to be there. I called an Uber to take me to the one place I could feel safe, a penthouse I had secretly bought years ago. It was empty and quiet, with floor-to-ceiling windows looking over the city skyline, a reminder that I was not small, not powerless. I was more than their dismissals and betrayals. I was strength and resilience. I was control. From that penthouse, I watched their world begin to unravel. The family group chat lit up with confusion and panic. Tuition payments bounced. Mortgage accounts were empty. Business lines frozen. Their perfect illusion of control was cracking. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. They didn't realize it yet. But the person they thought was their victim was now the one holding all the cards. And the game had just begun. By Monday morning, the fallout was no longer a distant threat, it had arrived. My brother's business account showed a notice: operations paused due to unexpected financial disruptions. What he didn't say was that he'd already laid off 3 employees. The lender I pulled his loan guarantee from moved fast. And without my backing, his entire business structure collapsed. It was a cruel awakening. Being the boss suddenly became a lonely, painful struggle when the money stopped flowing. In the family group chat, my cousin Natalie was the first to voice confusion. "Hey, does anyone know why my tuition payment bounced?" she asked. The silence that followed was deafening. Minutes later, my dad chimed in. "I just got a call from the bank. They said the trust account is empty. Is this a mistake?" The panic was spreading like wildfire. But no one knew the truth yet, that I had pulled the strings. Then came my brother's furious voice note. His words cut through the quiet like a whip. "What the hell did you do? I was told everything was taken care of." He didn't bother to mask his anger or disappointment. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed, nonstop calls from my mom, my dad, but I didn't answer. I let them ring, one after another. I wasn't here to explain myself. Hours later, my mom sent a text, the tone dripping with false concern. Please, can we talk? If you were upset, you should have said something funny. When I was in the hospital, you knew I wouldn't come unless I paid my own way. Her words were a thinly veiled attempt to manipulate. But now that she was scared, she found her voice. I didn't respond. Then my dad's message appeared. Family doesn't give up on each other over one mistake. One mistake. I almost laughed aloud. They left me alone in a hospital bed to chase their vacations. Then told me I wasn't worth the price of a plane ticket. That wasn't a mistake, it was a mirror. And finally, they were seeing their reflection clearly. No matter how ugly. But the real surprise was how quickly the crisis began creeping into their public lives. My brother's social media went quiet. His business account posted vague notices about temporary suspension due to financial disruptions. Investors ghosted him. The foundation he leaned on was crumbling. Suddenly, everyone could see the cracks in his carefully built facade. Then there was Natalie's TikTok. A cryptic video filled with tears and pleas about people abandoning you when you need them most. Comments were disabled. But friends sent me screenshots, sympathy from strangers who saw a family unraveling in real time. What no one knew was that this whole chain reaction was my doing. The family's online image shifted from perfect smiles on sandy beaches to uncomfortable silence. My parents posted nothing. No explanations. No excuses. Just a void where their carefully crafted story used to be. I could have stopped there. I could have let the money be the final word. But it wasn't just about finances. It was about years of emotional neglect and cruelty. They had taken from me without gratitude. And now it was time to return the favor quietly. Calculated. And irrevocably. The next day, I sent letters not to them, but to the church board where my dad was treasurer, and the school board where my mom volunteered. Enclosed were detailed financial summaries showing the anonymous donations I had made on their behalf over the years. Clearly traced back to me. There were no accusations. No angry words. Just cold facts. A week later, my mom resigned from the school board. My dad stepped down from the treasurer role, citing personal matters. My brother, last I heard, was begging for help through a GoFundMe titled Family Emergency. The irony wasn't lost on me. I never made a public statement. I never dragged them in the open. That's what they never understood. I didn't want revenge. I wanted distance. Control. Peace. The last message I ever sent in the family group chat was 3 words. You made this. Then I left. And I didn't look back. But the silence wasn't empty. It was powerful. Weeks passed. And the echoes of my silence rippled through the family's fragile world. What once was a carefully choreographed facade now crumbled under the weight of truth. I watched from afar as cracks widened, exposing years of neglect and entitlement in the harshest light. Their carefully crafted narrative was unraveling faster than they could spin it back together. My brother's business floundered. Every deal falling through. Every investor pulling away. The employees he had once relied on vanished, leaving him scrambling in empty offices and hollow conference rooms. The golden child was losing his shine. And with it, the last thread of his invincibility. At home, my parents tried to maintain appearances, but their smiles were thin and forced. Social gatherings turned cold. Friends whispered behind closed doors. And the whispers inevitably circled back to the scandal that no one wanted to face openly. The house they once called a legacy, my childhood home, was listed quietly for sale. A silent surrender to the financial reality I had forced upon them. Yet, amidst their falling world, I found unexpected peace. The penthouse I'd kept hidden, my secret fortress, became my refuge. No calls, no messages, no guilt or manipulation. Just the quiet hum of city lights below and the steady rhythm of my own breath. Here, I reclaimed my strength, piece by piece. But the story wasn't just about money. It was about years of emotional erosion, the subtle dismissals, the cruel jabs masked as jokes, the endless expectation that I'd carry the family without ever being seen. The hospital stay had been my breaking point. The moment I stopped bending and finally stood tall, I remembered the cold text from my mom, the cruel message from my brother, and the way my parents avoided my gaze when they thought I wasn't looking. Those moments crystallized my resolve. I was no longer their invisible caretaker, their fallback plan. I was my own person with a voice, with power, with boundaries. That's when I decided to take it further, not with rage, but with cold precision. I arranged meetings with lawyers and financial advisors, uncovering every last transaction, every hidden account, every misused fund. The trust that had quietly supported them was now a weapon, one I wielded with unyielding resolve. At the same time, I began quietly building my own world, investing in new ventures, reconnecting with old friends who saw me as more than the family's charity case, and surrounding myself with people who respected my worth. The contrast between my old life and my new one couldn't have been starker. One afternoon, I received an unexpected message from Natalie, my cousin, the first real olive branch since the fallout began. "I'm sorry," she wrote simply. "I didn't realize how much you carried." It was small, but it cracked open a door I hadn't known I'd left closed. Yet, not all bridges could be rebuilt. My brother sent another text, desperate and angry. "Why are you doing this? We're family. This is tearing us apart." I paused before replying, knowing this was the final test not just of our relationship, but of who I was now. "Family," I wrote back, "means support, respect, and honesty. You lost sight of that a long time ago. This isn't about tearing anyone down. It's about finally building something real." I didn't expect an answer. Meanwhile, the financial consequences continued to ripple. My parents faced mounting pressure from the church and school boards as the donations I'd made were publicly traced back to me. Resignations followed swiftly, reputations stained by association. The world they had presented as perfect was now littered with fractures. And through it all, I stayed silent in public, letting the facts speak louder than any outburst or drama. The quiet strength I'd cultivated was my message. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the author of my own story. But the most profound change was within me. The pain of years of rejection was transforming into a fierce clarity. I understood now that setting boundaries wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Walking away wasn't abandonment, it was liberation. Yet, I wondered quietly, what would it take for them to see me as more than just the sibling who fought back? Would they ever understand the cost of their neglect? Or was this the final curtain, the last act in a family drama that had played out too long? As the sun set behind the city skyline, I realized I had already answered that question for myself. This was no longer about them, it was about me, my future, and the life I would build from the ashes of the past. What comes next is the moment of reckoning, the confrontation, the revelation, and the ultimate test of who holds the power when the ties that bind begin to unravel completely. The weeks that followed the tentative reconciliation were a test of wills and hearts alike. Every message from my parents carried the weight of what had been lost and the fragile hope of what could be regained. I could hear the hesitation behind their words, the fear of facing the truth, the shame of past mistakes, and the yearning for a second chance. But I was no longer the silent caretaker. I was a woman reclaiming her story, her peace, and her power. Natalie and I grew closer during this period. She became not only a confidant but a reminder of the possibility of family beyond dysfunction. Together, we sifted through old memories, talked through long-buried grievances, and slowly began to understand how we had all become tangled in this web of expectations and neglect. Her presence was a balm, a softening in the hard edges of my resolve. One afternoon, I received an unexpected invitation, a family gathering, planned by Natalie, in the hope of creating a new chapter. It was small, just a few people, in a modest backyard with string lights and the scent of fresh herbs. The kind of space that felt more like home than any mansion or penthouse ever had. I debated attending, knowing the risks of reopening old wounds. But something inside urged me to say yes. When I arrived, the atmosphere was cautiously warm. My parents stood at the far end of the yard, visibly aged and humbled, their eyes filled with a mixture of regret and hope. My brother lingered awkwardly near the grill, the bravado replaced by a tentative sincerity. We weren't the perfect family here, far from it, but there was an earnestness in the air that hadn't existed before. As the night unfolded, we shared stories, not just the polished versions for public consumption, but the raw, unfiltered truths of our struggles and regrets. My mother spoke quietly about the weight of pride and how it had blinded her to my pain. My father confessed how much he'd missed while chasing status and image. My brother, surprisingly, apologized for the years of entitlement and distance. I listened, allowing the walls I had built to lower just enough to let healing seep through. It wasn't easy. There were tears and moments of silence heavier than words. But beneath it all was a collective desire to find some form of connection. Imperfect but real. Yet, as the evening wound down, I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act but a process. I was ready to move forward, but I couldn't erase the scars overnight. I set boundaries, clear and firm, knowing that love without respect was just another kind of pain. They accepted them, not always gracefully, but sincerely. That night, as I stepped onto the quiet balcony of my penthouse, the city lights shimmering below, I felt something shift. It was the weight of the past still there. Yes, but balanced by the strength of a future. I was determined to build on my own terms. I was no longer the invisible sibling, the family's financial safety net, or the silent sufferer. I was a woman with agency, voice, and the courage to demand both respect and love. In the months that followed, my life flourished. I reconnected with old friends, started new projects that sparked passion, and embraced a circle of chosen family who lifted me up rather than weighed me down. The chaos of my birth family no longer defined me. It was a chapter, not the whole story. However, the true test came when my brother reached out again, this time with a genuine desire to repair what had been broken. His humility was a shock, but also a chance, an opportunity to rewrite the narrative not as adversaries but as siblings. We began with cautious phone calls, sharing small victories and setbacks, building trust brick by brick. But life has a way of testing even the strongest resolve. A sudden health scare with my mother forced us all to confront what truly mattered beyond grudges and grievances. In that sterile hospital room, Watching her fragile breath, I found clarity. Family isn't perfect. It's complicated, messy, and sometimes painful, but it's also where we find our deepest strength. I stood by her side, not out of obligation, but choice. A choice born from the hard-fought journey of pain, betrayal, and, ultimately, acceptance. The road ahead was uncertain, and forgiveness was a winding path with no clear end. But for the first time, I walked it with open eyes and an open heart. And as I left the hospital that day, I realized the greatest revenge wasn't in destruction or retribution. It was in reclaiming my peace, defining my worth, and living a life unapologetically mine. The next chapter will explore how this new balance holds when past ghosts return and whether true freedom is ever fully possible.